Hey, welcome to our live cast today with Lisa. We're here to talk about backlog refinement. Lisa, I know that you're in Dallas. How's the weather over there?
It's hot.
Do you feel like you're in a sauna?
Yes, I feel like I'm in a sauna a little bit.
Yes. I'm in Arizona. Yes, we have dry heat. Yes, it's different and it's much better than a sauna. So you're welcome to come visit, but not right now because stay home, keep your mask on. We're just giving you a second, giving people a little bit to get on. But if you're here and you can hear us, I'd like you to type into the chat, have you seen Lisa present before? So yes or no. And then also, where are you? Because if you're in Dallas, that means nothing because we're staying home. But so type something in the chat. Where are you? Have you seen Lisa here before? And
If
then
you're
let
in
me
Dallas,
check on.
I'll connect with you next year. How's that? We'll put something on the calendar to connect
We'll
next
make
year.
a plan. All right. A couple of folks have been here with Lisa before. Some haven't. So Lisa, you better dazzle the newcomers today.
All
All
righty.
right. So here we are. We'll kick off. We are Lightspeed. We're an agile consultancy, the best, based out of the DC metro area. Lots of agile coaching and training, transformation support available to you. So reach out to us anytime. We're here with Lisa to talk about backlog refinement. You can claim one continuing education credit through Scrum Alliance or PMI. We'll email out some details, or you can always reach out to us, info@lightspeed.com. And Lisa, you have been working with Agile and supporting Agile teams and organizations for years now, but I did want to point out you also have a PhD in environmental science. Am I correct? And so how did you get into the Agile field?
It was a long and winding road. When I was in school, I had a study group with a guy who was an architect, and they were doing this sort of fun innovation type team work, and decided that they were going, in an extremely waterfall company, we're going to allow one team to try out Scrum. And he said, you would be a great PO for that. And I haven't looked back. So I started out as a PO on this one little innovation team in a 35,000 person company that did waterfall. And that's when I fell in love with it.
Love it. So here we are. I was distracted by the chat because we have a Lisa here who has not seen Lisa. So
Oh, hi,
I was
Lisa.
just focused on that. But if anyone does have a question throughout, feel free to pop it in the chat. I'll be fielding the hard ones to Lisa. Giving them to you. With that, let us know if you have questions. We'll stop throughout. But Lisa, take it away.
Will do. So welcome, everyone. I'm glad to see some of you sort of repeat offenders who are back for more. It always makes my heart feel good. If you were in my last webinar, hang on one second. My dog is about to start barking. So welcome to the new world. I will be right back. So Audrey, sorry, give me 1 second.
She's welcome anytime. Now, if you're looking at the chat, take a guess as to Lisa's dog's name. And Lisa, what size is your dog? That might give a hint to the name. Smaller dog. Smaller and cute.
Yes,
Okay.
she's very feisty. Sorry, she's like 10 pounds.
We had one guess, two guesses to the name. Scrum is one, Ralph is one. Thanks, Art and Stephanie. That's awesome. What's your dog's name, Lisa?
Her name is Binky.
Hey, Binky.
And if you know me, you know Binky. This is Binky. She's ferocious. Okay, so we're gonna get started. So back to business. Apologize for that. If you were in my last webinar, we talked about how to do sprint planning in 30 minutes or less. And if you haven't seen that webinar, you can actually go to the livespeed.com website and you can watch that when you're struggling with what to binge watch on Netflix this weekend. You're welcome to watch that webinar instead. One of the key components of being able to do sprint planning in 30 minutes or less is having a really nicely defined, refined, estimated, prioritized backlog full of really small stories when you start sprint planning, which means it's very easy to just adjust what the sprint contents is for the velocity of the team. Now, obviously, it's hard to get to having that many about 2 sprints worth of stories in your backlog that are nice and small and estimated if you're struggling with getting through a grooming session. I was just talking to a team yesterday that spent literally 2 days together and got 2 stories groomed. This is not helping your team at all, and it's definitely not going to help you get your backlog in order or get your sprint planning done in a reasonable amount of time. I'm sure we've all been in those uncomfortable sprint planning situations and in our uncomfortable backlog refinement sessions. So this webinar is about how to get to the point where your team can groom 12 stories an hour, which for many of you probably sounds impossible, but I'm going to show you how it's done. And it does take a little bit of work for you and your team to get there, but it is entirely possible. And when you can do this, you can get a couple of sprints ahead. And when you can get a couple of sprints ahead, your sprint planning becomes easy peasy lemon squeezy. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Here's a little background about me. I am actually from Texas, and I do love to travel. In fact, I'm usually traveling. I'm currently in a hotel room waiting to close on a house. So I apologize for the background. We have a couple of guiding principles to these refinement sessions. And the first one is, above all, it should not be painful. So if you have been in a painful refinement session, this webinar is for you. It should also not be a substitute for asking and answering architectural questions or design questions. This should not be the time where the Scrum team is getting bogged down trying to figure out whether their architecture even supports a story that they're trying to estimate. It should be a very crisp and efficient ceremony. Once your team gets to having about 2 sprints ahead in the backlog, you're probably only going to need to do a half hour of refinement in each week, so maybe an hour a sprint. It takes a little work to get to that point, but once you sort of learn the tactics and the agenda and how to do this quickly and efficiently, this grooming session or this refinement session, depending on where you are in the world, should take maybe a half hour total a week. And we can talk later if you'd like about different ways to how to schedule that and how to kind of chunk it up so that it's easier on the Scrum team. The fourth principle is that it should be based on realistic expectations. And in other words, what do we actually expect to achieve during this grooming session? In other words, if I'm a PO and I come to a grooming session and I don't even know what I'm asking for in this story, you cannot expect to get an estimate on that story. And then finally, coming in there with a very clear definition of ready. If you're familiar with your definition of done, having a definition of ready is very helpful to the Scrum team, but it's also a key to making sure that your grooming sessions are crisp and efficient and a good use of people's time. Finally, the last thing, as always, you should always discuss how your sprint ceremonies are going in your retrospective. It's always a great thing to talk about, hey, you know, did we do okay with that estimate? How was our agenda in our grooming session? How did we do in sprint planning? And just think about, well, if that didn't quite go the way we wanted, or we felt like maybe we were wasting time or swirling a little bit too much or over-engineering things, talk about that stuff as a team and figure out what you can change in your ceremony in order to make that better. And at the end of this, I'll actually give you some nice tactical first steps that you can take, some baby steps if you need to, or some other things to look out for, things that you might not be noticing that might be impacting how these ceremonies are going. Finally, it should be extremely disciplined and extremely outcome oriented. I'm sure this has not happened to any of you that you just sat in a grooming session and people just swirled and talked about all kinds of things and tried to solution too much, and it just took hours and hours, and ultimately at the end of it, you still don't have an estimate on your little story. So if that is happening to you, the whole motivation behind this entire webinar is to show you guys how to make that a very disciplined, outcome-oriented ceremony in order to make sure that you have a backlog of stories that the Scrum team can work on, because there's nothing worse than having a dry pipeline for a Scrum team and then possibly even interjecting stuff in the middle of the sprint, which is going to slow your Scrum team down. So we're just going to go back to basics here. This is straight out of the Scrum, I love to always ground myself in the Scrum guide. I work with a lot of teams who have moved pretty far from the Scrum guide and have kind of forgotten what the fundamentals are. So we're going to talk about Backlog refinement, as it's referred to in the Scrum guide, and now, trivia, backlog refinement is actually not a Scrum ceremony. It's not an official one, but it is kind of hard to do Scrum if you're not doing it. So even though it's not an official ceremony, teams wind up doing it. So there are a couple of things that Scrum, what this backlog refinement is not. One of them is the first time that a PO has actually thought through the requirements or the priority of the thing you're looking at. So this should not be, well, I'm not exactly sure how I want this to work kind of a conversation. If that's happening, you just need to stop it right there, send it back to the drawing board, and wait until there's some clarity on the outcome from your PO. It should also not be the first time that architectural questions are addressed. What we don't want to see is something coming into a grooming session and the devs are like, that's a fantastic idea, but we're going to have to completely replatform, and that's going to take us a year if we want to implement anything like this. So those questions should be answered up front. Dev team, it's also your responsibility to make sure you reviewed these stories before you get in there. So this should not be the first time that you've seen a story or heard about its parent feature. That means the POs, as you start developing features, you need to have like a mini kickoff with the dev team, describe what the feature is, why you're doing it, kinds of things that you anticipate to happen, have those architectural and design questions already answered. And then when you start presenting the stories, there will be some familiar context for people to latch onto in order to have a good understanding of what the bigger picture is and help guide them in terms of giving their estimates. Also, absolutely do not spend your time, number one, over solutioning, or that's the last bullet, an opportunity for solutioning at all, and definitely not over solutioning. You do not have to figure everything out in a grooming session. But you also don't want to spend an endless amount of time just swirling about, well, maybe it could be this, maybe it could be that, what if that, what if that. Have all of that stuff already figured out before you get in there. And that's a huge burden on the shoulders of your PO or your product management team in general, whatever their title is to make sure that that stuff is thought through. And I'm going to show you in a minute some of the ways in which you can sort of force those synapses to work in a way that ensures that the stories you come to grooming with actually are small and well thought out and have clear requirements on them. What the backlog refinement or grooming, and now I flip back and forth between those things, what it's meant to be is an opportunity to get good enough clarity on what the intended outcome is in order to give a good enough story point or relative estimate for the sprint after next. I'm a big fan of the N+2 thing, which basically is you should have your features figured out, a couple of features ahead, and you should have a backlog of stories that are about 2 sprints ahead, given whatever the team's velocity tends to be. So you want to be grooming stories, not for the sprint you're about to start, like in an hour, and not for the sprint that you're currently in. Definitely not. We all know that's not that's a no-go. But for the sprint at least after the one that you're currently in. It's also an opportunity for a PO and the development team to knowledge share about what makes a good story. What kind of information do I need? What is too much in the weeds? What's not enough information? And it also allows the development team and the PO to work together to figure out, okay, if this is a good story, how do we get better at estimating these stories? Now, granted, POs don't estimate stories, but they can help when you find that your teams are constantly have half the team is estimating at a 1, half the team is estimating at an 8. That means there's something unclear about what the intended outcome is because people have different ideas about how this thing is going to be implemented. So that will help the PO then learn how to write stories with the proper kinds of information. That will allow the development team to give an estimate that they feel pretty good about. You do have responsibilities as a Scrum team, and again, Scrum team includes the PO and the Scrum Master, development team is the devs and the QA. So as a Scrum team, you all have individual responsibilities coming into this, and some of them are role-based and some of them are just as a healthy team, these are things that you would do. So what the PO, and POs, sorry, it's a lot of responsibility for you, but this is kind of the job of the PO on a Scrum team is to have good consumable work queued up for the Scrum team. That is the primary focus. That's the main reason for this role. You want to come to grooming with a backlog full of really good, small, ready stories. And if you're in whatever tool you have, they should be listed in priority order. You should have a good sense of what small means for your team. For me, that means smaller than 3 story points. They should be independent and they should be crystal clear. And this is a lot of work, and it may take you a lot of time to get caught up and make sure that you're feeding these things to the Scrum team. But once you do, it'll be super easy to maintain. And Bonus, you'll actually get what you're asking for in a sprint because the Scrum team's not going to be confused about what you want. And so there's not a lot of back and forth about what did you mean here? Do you mean this? Should I test that? That will all be answered ahead of time. So minimal context switching, minimal swirl around questions, and your Scrum teams will actually be way more productive. And you get to give your business owners or your customers what they're asking for a lot more quickly. So this is key to delivering value really, really, really rapidly. The other thing is that as a PO, you have to come to this meeting with decision-making authority. If you have to come in and somebody asks questions like, oh, does this go on the left or the right? And you're like, well, I have to go escalate that and ask, my boss whether that should be this, and then they have to go ask the business, and then they have to go ask compliance. If all of that is happening, then you need to fix that, because whoever is standing in there providing these requirements to the Scrum team has to have decision-making authority about how these things look and function and behave and what the intended outcome is. If that's not happening, you're just going to wind up in a bunch of swirl and you're going to slog the team down. And then finally, a really, really, really clear vision of what you want. If you can't express clearly what you want, the Scrum team is going to have no idea what you want. They're not psychic, or maybe they are, maybe their license expired, I don't know, but they're not going to be able to code what you're asking for. And then at the end, you're just going to see this thing and it's not going to look like anything you had imagined, and then you have a whole bunch of rework. So as a PO, come in with a crystal clear idea of what you're anticipating, and then that will help the Scrum team actually implement what you want. That means that the Scrum team can also give you, or the development team can give you feedback on, hey, I know that this is sort of spec'd out to look like this and to function this way, but if we use a tool that we currently have, it might operate slightly differently, but you'll achieve the same outcome. What do you say we do that? Because it'll take a lot less time. Those are great conversations to have in here. So you want to know exactly what you want, but you also have to be flexible enough to get input from the dev team when they tell you, hey, if we do it slightly differently in this tool, then this will still achieve the same outcome, we think. What do you think of that? You've got to have a mindset where you're willing to let that happen so that you can get stuff out the door more quickly. Other contributions from the team: Scrum Master. It's your job to enforce the definition of ready. And by ready, I mean these things. It's in priority order. It's a small story. It's independent. It's crystal clear. I'm going to show you how to use gherkins here in a minute to make sure that your requirements are crystal clear. It is your job to make sure that that definition of ready is met before you bombard the development team with a bunch of noise and sloppy stories. I recommend putting a 5-minute time limit on stuff. Any story that is ready, you can estimate in 5 minutes. If you can't get an estimate on it in 5 minutes, it's not ready. It's sort of a two-way street there. You can put the 5-minute limit on it, and you can just use that as your definition of ready. Like, we can get a good enough estimate in 5 minutes. If we have to ask so many more questions that it's going way past 5 minutes, it's not ready. So that's a great benchmark for your team. And that's how you get to 12 stories an hour. You come in 5 minutes, we don't have enough info, great, back to the PO, next story. And you just keep cycling through that. Use a timer, it's awesome. Use one with a loud and obnoxious buzzer in the beginning if you need to drive the point home that if we can't figure it out in 5 minutes, it's not ready, it's just noise, go back to the drawing board and come back to us when you have something that we can estimate quickly. The entire development team, hopefully, once you start implementing these things, you'll start seeing a backlog starting to fill out where your product owner is working ahead of you and has started lining things up in your backlog. Review them in those moments that you're waiting for something to build or you're waiting for a script to run. Just glance over them and get a sense of what's coming up. Read through the stories, understand the requirements. And that way, when you go to grooming, you can ask questions that you've already thought about. Or you can tell a product owner, hey, I was reading the story and I think if we split this up, it'll be a little easier for us to do. Those kinds of things can all happen, and you should be taking the time. You should own that backlog as well, just to review it so that it's not the first time you see stuff when you come into grooming. And then finally, it's everybody's job to understand what the risks are for anything that's coming up in the backlog. Understand, is this a wonky area of the code? Is that really brittle? Is this in our legacy, stack that is always breaking? And there's all these things that we have to watch out for. Do we have the ability to test these things? These are all questions that you guys should have a good understanding of before you come into grooming, so you can figure out how you're going to deal with them. Any dependencies that they may have. It's really helpful for a PO when they've got everything in priority order. If they hear from a dev, hey, we have to do this story before we do that story because there's something, whatever the dependency might be. It's super helpful for a PO to hear that ahead of time, so you're not having that conversation in the middle of grooming. So if you can just take a second to glance over the backlog at some point during your day, during the sprint, you can avoid spending all kinds of time talking through those things in the grooming session. So I've emphasized a lot that we need good small stories, and my favorite way to do this is gherkins. I love a good gherkin because this makes it so completely clear for a Scrum team or for a development team what they need to code, what they need to test, and what the anticipated outcome is. If you think of how easy it is if you have folks who are logging bugs and they are really clear about steps to reproduce, like do this, do this, do this, do this, I'd expect to see this, but instead I saw that. This is that is crystal clear. You know exactly where you are in the code, you know exactly what's going on, and you know exactly what the intended outcome is, and also what inadvertently happened instead of that intended outcome. So it gives you lots of information to go in there and start to try to fix it. The same thing is true for gherkins. And gherkins, I'm not going to go into BDD and automated testing. What we're going to do is we're going to appropriate gherkins from the BDD automated testing world, and we're going to use them to help you create these nice, tiny, little crystal clear stories. And this is how they work. So you have your usual user story as a blank, whoever I am, whoever your persona is, I need to XYZ, so that, blah, 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 blah. Don't forget the so that, by the way. This is not a webinar on writing these kinds of stories, but please don't forget the so that. Super important so you know why you're actually doing the work. All of the stuff needs to be written in plain English. If I see the name of a method in here or a database, I'm going to freak out. So do not use technical jargon or technical anything in there. What we want is for you to be able to show your grandmother or your CEO, they probably both have equal understanding of your technology, show either one of them this gherkin, these acceptance criteria, and they will know exactly what you're after. So this is how a gherkin works. It's over here on the right under acceptance criteria. You have the given, it's the context, it's when I'm on this page. That's it. That's all you need to know. That's an immediate clue to devs and QA. This is where I need to be. You might have additional things like I'm on this page and I've logged in successfully and I have, XYZ, something else. So you can kind of list those things. Don't get crazy because you don't have to list every precondition because then you'll basically be writing like an entire workflow just in the context. There's a point at which that becomes overkill. You should be able to assume some things about, like, if I'm on that page and only people with certain permissions can be on that page, I don't have to list that I need permissions, right? Because clearly that doesn't matter, right? You don't have to list that out. I mean, it's that kind of thinking. It's a little bit of an art. So you've got your given. Here I am, and all of these things are also kind of feeding into my context. When is super important. It's a single call to action. Notice there are no ands or ors on this. It is a one action that the user is completing. It's a click, it's a scroll down, it's a drop down, the page appears, whatever it is. It is a call to action. So if you think of it as something like a button, that would be a when. When I click the button, that's it. There's no and, there's no or, it's a single action. And then you've got the intended outcome. Then, okay, what's happening? Okay, so I'm here, I'm this person, this is why we're doing this work, I've clicked on this button, what do I expect? What do I, as a PO, want to see happen when this thing is done? So that's where you can add additional ands. Then this page opens up and I see whatever, the last thing I filled out, and I, can whatever. So these are all the additional things that you would anticipate seeing. You do not want to have too many ands in a story because oftentimes those ands actually wind up representing different stories. So for example, if you're building a new page and ultimately what you want is that when you open that page, there's something there, and then there's the ability to click here, and then there's a badge that appears there. Those, if you wind up putting lots of ands in the thens, that's a great red flag that probably these are all new functionality and can all be new features. So let me show you how this works. I just stole this from one of the groups that I'm working with, one of our clients. And this is an actual gherkin, and this is kind of how they wound up writing this. So she initially started with a single story that was basically, okay, they have two different systems, and it's just a whatever. We won't go into, past poor life choices about why these things are in two different systems, but they are in two different systems, and each system has a screen where the same information needs to be appeared. needs to be displayed. So it needs to appear on these two screens. And you get a checkbox, you get a box checked basically on this thing, on both screens. The logic works the same way, it's just in two different places. You get this checkbox if you have done like three things, if there's three pieces of logic that are true. You can also get that checkbox, if those three pieces of logic aren't true. You can also get this checkbox if on a different thing, those three pieces of logic are true. I know that sounds very convoluted, but this is one story for them. They had no idea how to estimate. It's the other great thing about small stories. The smaller they are, the easier they are to estimate. We are terrible at putting estimates on big things. When you get it down really, really, really tiny, it's so much easier to put an estimate. It's so much more as accurate as an estimate can be. I mean, they're not accurate, but you can have a lot higher confidence estimating 2-point stories than you can 8-point stories in terms of, how likely those are to derail your sprint. So go for the small stories. They're super clear, super easy to estimate. And this was an enormous story. Don't even get me started on batches, right? Because we all know how I feel about batches and enormous lists of requirements in one story. That's one big batch you're throwing at your dev and your QA. And if you know anything about lean, you know that drives me crazy. So we don't want batches. What we want is small individual things going through. But this was all one giant story. And this is what she did. And the assumption there on the dev team was, well, I'm already in there working. I might as well do all of that anyway. So it's this a false assumption that having a large batch actually makes you more efficient. And all of the science, all of the data, all of the math is there that proves that this is not true. Batches are bad. You want to have small chunks of work going through your system. And then the other argument for having it all in one thing, and this part's actually true, is that unless it's all out there, there's no value to the customer. So I need to know, this is very critical, that I know that this thing has happened and that this person qualifies. Because if they don't, all kinds of crazy things are going to happen. If I don't, if they don't qualify and I start going through this workflow, all kinds of weird things are going to happen. And so, yeah, it's absolutely true that without this whole thing put together, it's not going to have any value to the customer. The difference here is between how we're going to chunk up the work to flow through the system, how we're basically going to craft our to-do list with different layers of value and getting to that final point, and then actually putting it in the customer's hands. You can flow this work through the system in tiny pieces. It does not mean that you have to go live with it that way. When you have the group and they're all done and they're all tested and everybody's happy, then you can expose that to the customer, and then the customer gets all the value. But you've allowed lean to work by having small chunks flowing through the system. It's basically, how are we doing the work versus the value that we're delivering to the customer. So it is true, that whole story has no value to the customer unless it's all deployed, and nobody's arguing that. The key is release it when it's all done, but work on it in small pieces. So there's always a good question here about how many stories you think this is going to turn into. And once we started diving deep and then starting to write additional stories for maybe error messages and pop-ups and things like that, it turned into a couple of dozen stories, believe it or not. And this is what the stories tended to look like. And this is how gherkins work. This is how you have small stories. This is how you groom 12 stories an hour. You have in this first case, it's one screen, and we're working towards this idea that there's this one set of requirements, and if you hit all three, then you get this badge. So given that I'm on the badges screen and my score on this one thing was greater than 50, when this list is displayed, then the box is checked. And then the contrary scenario is when that's not true. Well, that's just one tiny piece. The very next story, and okay, granted, that doesn't actually mean that the badge is checked, but this is a great test that the system is working and communicating with one another. The next story, you layer on a little bit extra logic. We know that first story is already completed and done and works. And so now it's, okay, not only do I have to get that first score greater than 50, I have to get the second thing score greater than 25. And then we can go in and work on that and code that and test that. Believe me, your QA is probably jumping up and down right now, because if they have to QA that as one story, there are so many logical paths that could go wrong that they are going to jump with glee that they can go in here and identify exactly where something broke. If they test this first story and it's broken, they know that's where the problem is, and they can send it back to dev to fix. If they test the second story and it's broken and the first one passed, they know, okay, well, it must be when you did the beginner level part 2, because the beginner level part 1 was already tested and it works. And that saves everybody time trying to figure out why a thing is broken. And this just goes on so on and so on and so on. So you would have to add the third criterion, and then you would know, okay, great, we've met this first thing, so we get our badge. Then you have to do this for the second case where, okay, I didn't meet any of those, but in a different universe, I meet these, and then you have to do all of those, and then you have to duplicate that for the other screen. So this did wind up being several dozen stories, and they all wound up being small, and they all wound up being 2 or 3 story points. And the interesting thing, this always happens, the original story was estimated at an 8, and they got several dozen stories that were all in that 2 to 3 range. And so you do the math, right? Which one of those do you think is a better representation of the work that it's going to take? So there are a couple of really tactical things. We're sort of wrapping this up here. These are the last few slides because I want plenty of time for you guys to ask questions. So really tactical advice. You always have to have a definition of ready and a definition of done in place. This has to be something that the product team and the dev team agree on what does ready look like. It's small, it's clear, it's independent. Once you would agree on that, that conversation about, you know what, this isn't ready becomes much easier. The PO will go, yeah, you know what, you're right. We spent too much time talking about this. Clearly, I'm not straight on what I intend, and so I'll take it back and I'll go work on it. If you don't have a clear definition of ready in place, that conversation gets really hard. You have to come to refinement with that list of clear prioritized story, because then you can just go through and just keep yourself a couple sprints ahead. Time box it, 5 minutes a story. If you need to catch up, so say you're in a position where you're constantly playing catch up and you're currently grooming stories for the sprint that you're currently in, which is bad, don't do that. If you need to spend time catching up, take a breath and build time into your next sprint. Make it a task, put some story points on it. Allow yourselves the opportunity to get caught up, and that will open up so much time for you to be able to actually do the work. A lot of times when we get really far behind, we try to catch up. And so then we have to put more meetings on the calendar, which takes away meeting time, which makes us further and further behind. And so then we put more meetings on the calendar to deal with the fact that we're further behind. This is a death spiral. So you need to stop it and you need to get caught up, because going forward, if you do vanilla Scrum and you're doing 3 amigos and you're having these kinds of grooming sessions and planning sessions, it will give everybody space to breathe. And the maintenance of this backlog is so much easier than the constant struggle of trying to catch up. So what does this look like in practice? You come in, I love it when a PO owns this invite, because the PO is the one that's up to their eyeballs in the backlog and kind of know, are we about 2 sprints ahead or not? So, hey, if I'm feeling good about what we've got estimated, then I can cancel the meeting and give the team some time back. So I like it when a PO owns the meeting. That's not written in stone. The Scrum Master could own it, anybody could own it really, but just make sure it happens. The PO will start off with a brief overview of which stories we're intending to groom. Like, hey, remember that feature? These are the kinds of stories that we're going into it. We're going to try to finish up this screen. Be very clear about what you intend to accomplish in this meeting. Have a timekeeper. Could be the Scrum Master, could be anybody, but somebody's got to have the timer on their phone with that loud, obnoxious ring at the end, so the whole team knows that time's up. We're going to move on. If you have your backlog in priority order, then the order in which you groom things is starting at the top and just working your way down. That's all you have to do. That's why it's so important to keep things in priority order. What that does is ensure that you as a team are not spending your time grooming something that's not going to happen for 6 months. You are grooming the next immediate thing on your list. That is why having a backlog in priority order is so important, because you want to be sure that you are grooming things on the right time horizon. I want to groom the next immediate things and not stuff that may not even ever happen because it's so far down the road. And so you just keep going until your session ends. If you're not anywhere near this state, which is entirely possible, we've got about 70 people on the phone, so the odds are at least one of you is not anywhere near this state. You can get there in a couple of different ways. One of them is just to start by creating this definition of ready. It's what does a good story look like for our Scrum team? Let us help you write some stories. Let's understand what good gherkins look like. Let's understand what small looks like and independent looks like and clear looks like for our Scrum team. So start there if you don't have one already. Start practicing writing gherkins. I strongly recommend, and this is something that I implement with my teams, and I actually help doing this too, if you're having some trouble getting caught up, as a Scrum team, come together and help your PO out with writing gherkins. This is great for lots of reasons. One of them, you get good at writing gherkins and you recognize good ones when you see them. Excuse me, I'm gonna grab a quick drink of water. So you know what a good gherkin looks like. Oddly, that didn't help at all. Sorry.
Well, let's pause for a second because we do want to collect some questions. We have a few, but feel free to take this moment to stick in your burning questions so we can get to them all.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't think I've ever had this many interruptions in a webinar. So
makes it exciting.
Keeps it fresh. Okay, so start with your definition of ready. Get really good at writing gherkins. As a Scrum team, help your PO catch up, because guess what? If your PO is caught up, that means you will know exactly what you need to be doing, which means less swirl about having to go track down your PO and ask a question and get clarity on a thing. All of that goes away. So that will actually make your lives a lot better. Just buckle down, write a few gherkins with your PO. It helps you recognize what a good one is. It will help them get caught up, and that will make your life a lot better. It's not going to become your day job, but it is. It's great when a team can come together and get their backlog in order. Finally, you want to get in a 2 sprints at some point. This is your end game. You want to get to about 2 sprints ahead. You want to make sure that if you use 3 Amigos or some other version of this, make sure that your architects or lead devs and your lead QA and your UI UX folks and your POs are talking about features a couple of months ahead of when you anticipate the Scrum team to be working on them, so that these major architectural and design and flow questions don't come up in grooming because they've already been answered. And then finally, your stories, your things in Jira or TFS or whatever tool you're using should not be conversation starters. They should be the outcomes of your conversations. I can't tell you how many times I've seen Jira tickets that have like copy pasted email threads where people are just swirling back and forth trying to answer questions, or, that is just noise. So eliminate that stuff. When you have an idea of what these stories need to look like and what the requirements are, you've had all the conversations about architecture and design, then start getting these nice, crisp, clean stories into Jira and leave all that mess somewhere else. Finally, in grooming, here's some what we call anti-patterns in Agile. Never really like that word, but it seems to fit. So one of the things that you want to look out for is over-solutioning. That is something that devs tend to do a lot because we're all problem solvers, and we want to get it, we want to figure it out now. Remember that you just need to know enough to give a good enough estimate, something that you're comfortable with. You don't have to solution the whole entire thing. Sometimes you run into, well, we could implement it this way or we could implement it that way. It's okay to say, well, if we implement it this way, it's 3 story points. If we implement it that way, it's 8 story points, but we're going to spend some time figuring out which one it is, and then we can come back and revisit this, right? So that's a totally fine approach. If you're not quite sure exactly how you're going to implement it, especially if that depends on something maybe you're currently working on, feel free to just kind of give a shot, at estimating in the 2 possible scenarios. It's totally fine. Do not accept stories that are not ready. We all are people pleasers. We want to make sure if somebody asks us to do something that we do it. Don't do that. It's okay. It's okay to send it back. As long as it doesn't conform to your definition of ready, it's all right to say, hey, we need more information. We don't want to swirl for 2 hours on just, trying to get a clear idea of what you want. The other thing really to look out for in grooming, now remember, I haven't talked at all about relative estimation or team dynamics while this is going on, but remember, this is the ceremony where that stuff is happening. You might be using planning poker, you might be just doing whatever, using some other app, you might just be putting your fingers up in the air, however it is that you're doing relative estimation. You need to be sure that your devs and QA are putting out their estimates as a team at the same time. Do not split this up between the dev estimate and the QA estimate. Everybody is putting their estimate together for what this piece of work might entail. And be sure that everybody in that room is heard with any questions they might have. This means if you're like me and you're a loudmouth and you like to talk and jump in when somebody asks a question, you need to learn to shut up, just like I did. So count in your head to 8. Let the quiet people on the team ask their questions. Let them voice their concerns before you jump in there. So it's a really hard thing to do. I've been working on it for 20 years. I still can't get it quite right. So I have lots of sympathy for you, but you've got to start working on that. Let the quiet people be heard, because guess what? Usually the quiet people, they're the ones that are right. They're usually the ones with the good questions and the good answers. And the other thing, as a PO, be sure that you have a clear goal for the session. If you get in there and you kind of swirl and people are scrolling up and down in the backlog, like, well, maybe we could estimate this story. Don't do that. If you're at that state, cancel the session, get out of that state, and then put a session on the calendar, okay? So what does a successful grooming or refinement session look like? You come out of there understanding all of the requirements and how you're going to implement it just well enough. Again, don't over solution it to provide a reasonable story point estimate for it and get your backlog into being about 2 sprints ahead. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Audrey, who's been diligently monitoring the chat channel for questions.
And thanks everyone for entering in your questions. If you can't stick around for this next section of figuring out all the challenges, solutions, questions, answers, thank you so much for spending time with us today. We're not going anywhere, so email info@lightspeed.com or connect with Lisa on LinkedIn. Her email address is here. Let's kick off some questions. So when you approach it this way, Lisa, in your experience, are some clarification iteration with the PO to actually get the stories ready with help from 1 or 2 folks on the dev team still happening?
Yes.
Done. When's that?
Well, more than that? No, that absolutely is happening because sometimes you might have a PO that's not used to doing things this way. And so it is very helpful. It's a collaborative effort, and it should be. So if a PO is struggling to understand either how these things break up in your technology or what the dev team needs, absolutely say, hey, this story isn't ready. We need to send it back to you. Then as a good dev lead or anybody on the team, you can say, hey, why don't I work with you later and we can kind of think through this and I can give you some pointers on how this might be broken up. Likely what's going to happen is your team is going to say, this is too big. These 3 things need to be broken up into different pieces, go back to the drawing board and kind of, frame those up and bring them back as different stories. And sometimes it's clear enough that you can actually just kind of annotate a quick estimate on there anyway. But yes, if you're struggling for some reason and you need to go through these iterations, it should absolutely be a conversation with your devs and QA as well, because the QA part's important too, remember. 1 line of code change might require 3 days of testing for a QA. So just because it takes a dev 5 minutes, it doesn't mean that the story is small.
All right, a couple of questions about story points. Why do you like to average story points at 3 or less? Just curious.
So this is a lean principle. This is the, having small work represents not having batches. So you heard me go off about batches earlier. So if things get bigger than 3 story points, they typically are batches and you wind up just with a lot of work. So there's that piece of it. There's just the lean flow and how that works and the mechanisms there that make sure things are flowing through the system. It only works when stuff is small. Or small batches or batch sizes of 1. So a larger than 3, I actually kind of draw the line at an 8 for a sprint. If it's an 8 or a 5, typically you can break it down into several more stories. 3 on average is really what a kind of 3 or less is really your target, because that keeps things nice and small. That doesn't mean game the system and make your stories all 3 story points. This means like have legitimate, small stories that are represented by 1s and 2s and 3s, so that you have lean principles run, in action for your Scrum team, which is going to help all of this stuff happen. The other reason is just psychological. If you're working on an 8-point story that's just rolled over from sprint to sprint to sprint to sprint to sprint, it's a little bit of a beatdown. There's a lot of endorphins that are released when we succeed at things and when we accomplish things and when we finish things. There's like all kinds of brain chemistry and science that happens here. And if you can give people that little hit multiple times throughout the week, believe me, it will make your team happier. So being able to finish a small thing and put it in done makes everybody feel good. And so there's lots of reasons there. Not only does it work in lean, and if you love math, there's lots of mathematical reasons that works, but also it keeps your team happy.
How do you separate or combine the point estimation between dev and QA?
You don't separate it or combine it. You don't. That's my short answer to that one. So this is how it would work. The PO comes in front of the Scrum team and says, hey, here's our requirements. everybody all at the same time asks their questions. So QA questions, dev questions, you get a good sense of what's intended in the story. You'll have a sense of, oh, this is probably what I'm going to need to test. And devs will kind of know what they need to implement. And then everybody gives an estimate for, this is why it's important to have your definition of done in place, because you're thinking about our definition of done likely includes things like coding, code review, and testing. So if that's in your definition of done, what you're giving an estimate is what is it going to take to get this thing to a definition of done? It's not about what is the time for dev and what is the time for QA. And what's going to happen in the beginning is you're going to have lots of conversations about QA saying things that are an 8 and dev is saying, no, it's just a 1 because it's just a code change. And then QA is going to go, yeah, but it's going to take me 5 days to test. What you have there in that conversation is a learning and an understanding of what kind of work is required for the whole team to get something across the finish line. And eventually, I mean, and I say eventually, it doesn't even take very long, but after a couple of sprints, your devs have a good sense of what QA's job is, and your QA have a good sense of what dev's job is. And it is amazing to watch that through these conversations. I mean, it sounds like, oh, QA has no idea what dev does. Well, that's probably because you never talk about it. So once you start talking about it, you will have an idea of what the other group is usually trying to do. And so then you can estimate a story. And then if you're wildly different, then you have those conversations about why you might be wildly different. And it's amazing to watch, but they always converge. And it's always just dev and QA, a single story point estimate.
All right, we have some great questions here. Lisa, I wanted to check in on time. Did you need to wrap up or can we keep it rolling?
No, we can keep it rolling.
All right, so do you have any good tips for a prioritization matrix?
Yes, I have lots of things like that.
We should just keep it to yes and no questions. So
yes, I know, right? Yeah. Do you have recommendations? Yes, I do. Next. So there's a technique that we use at the feature level. It's called WSJF, weighted shortest job first. And really that is just looking at the cost of delay. So basically the opportunity cost if we don't do something, divided by the amount of effort that it takes to do a thing. And sometimes when I'm working with POs who are kind of new to this and aren't quite sure how to prioritize stuff, it's often helpful to do kind of a back of the envelope WSJF type exercise with that. So you weigh the cost of delay is composed of business value and risk risk reduction opportunity enablement, and then time criticality. So if you can, and you can do relative estimation on all those things as well. And then you divide by the effort. And so again, these are not, deep, super accurate, super precise things. But if you really don't know how to prioritize stories, you can, for yourself, kind of be thinking along those lines of, well, what's the cost if we don't do the thing? And what we're trying to do is get the biggest bang for the buck. So if you've got something that's really simple and is a huge win for the business, that's obviously the one you want to do first. And if you've got something that you think might be lower value and is probably going to take a little while to do, don't do that one. Do something that's going to give you a lot of value really quickly. So any of those tools out there that are something about balancing effort with the value to the business and the customer is what you want to kind of balance in your brain in terms of prioritization. So you can use that at the story level too. It's usually used for features, but it's totally fine to use at the story level if you just kind of need a place to start.
All right. When do you write gherkins?
When do you write gherkin?
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to have to imagine that you've got everything in place and you've had a Three Amigos meeting. So you have architectural and design questions sort of answered up front at the feature level, which, by the way, if you're in Jira, sort of apologizing on behalf of Atlassian, is a Jira Epic. That's what I'm talking about, something that's about 1 to 3 months. If you're a couple of months out with that, you can start thinking about how you're going to break down these stories almost immediately. And then you want to be 2 sprints ahead with groomed stories. So you should be writing gherkins like 3 to 4 weeks ahead of when you anticipate a Scrum team to start picking them up.
All right. And then what do you do if the PO is highly dependent on the dev's input for writing stories and maybe asks, what stories do you guys want me to write for this feature, or write stories that are unclear?
I've actually worked with a team where it was kind of a startup and the devs were actually the original POs, right? So they had really good product knowledge and they really understood their customers and they still had great relationships with the customers. And the dev team, and they had been there for like 15 years and then they got a new PO. It's kind of like, who are you going to listen to in that situation, right? And so the devs did have a lot of influence about what the backlog looked like, but that was just an agreement that they had with the product team. But really, the prioritization of the backlog and what needs to be happening is the responsibility of the product management organization. So if your PO is not getting that direction, I would ask, well, what's going on in the product management organization that your PO doesn't know what the product needs? So hopefully there's someone above them who's looking at strategy and has a roadmap, and then the PO is on the execution side and writing the stories for the dev team. But that, you know, the question, asking a dev team what they think should go in there, unless it's a tech debt item or it's like the very, very, very rare situation I just described, really, that's not the person you need to be asking. You need to be asking the business what you should be doing next.
Super. I love this one.
Right.
When time boxing, what do you do when the timer goes off? Just move on, bring the story back in another session, or what if you're refining for the next sprint?
Yeah, so don't get crazy with that, right? Like if you're at 5 minutes and you're this close to getting an estimate, you know, allow time to have the estimate, right? So you don't have to get super crazy. But if, you know, sometimes people just need to wrap up a single question and you need to think about it, need to put an estimate, and that might take another, you know, a little tiny bit of time. You'll know when it's at 5 minutes, if you're super close, then, you know, and then if that conversation that you thought was close turns out not to be close, then you can shut it down and send it back. So that's kind of how you do it. And then, you know, it would just come back in your next grooming session. And if it's something that's really urgent, you might put another quick grooming session on the calendar to look at all the stories that you weren't able to groom. So again, remember what I said at the beginning, you need to have as many as is required to keep yourselves about 2 sprints ahead. So if you're not 2 sprints ahead, you just need to sort of, you know, stockpile these guys and bring up another grooming session and groom the ones that needed to, that didn't quite fit the 5-minute threshold. But yeah, you should be pretty rigorous about it, but not crazy, if that makes sense.
This question fits right into that. How do we help the PO get caught up? We don't have 2 sprints worth of work.
Yeah, that's awesome. So your PO is going to have to figure out what they want done. So hopefully they have a couple of features lined up that they want to have worked on. And one way that you can do it is just put it on your backlog for the sprint and just put a workshop together where maybe they talk through a feature and then you as a team work together to get gherkins written for the next feature. So you can totally own it and help the PO get caught up. And you can continue to do that as long as you need to do it to get caught up. So you might need to put a little extra grooming session or an extra task on your on a couple of sprints until you finally find your way, you know, you get your head above water. So dev team, QA are great at gherkins, by the way. It's just something about the way QA brains work that they are very well aligned to how gherkins work.
All right. How do you have a productive conversation with the PO if you find you're always having to go back and rework a story?
Well, that is the productive conversation. The productive conversation is, I have no idea what you want, so I'm not going to waste your time or my time trying to dive in there and figure it out as I go, right? So the productive conversation is the realization that this thing is not ready for someone to start coding it because we don't know exactly what's wanted. So that is the productive conversation. If you have to keep sending stuff back, you know, if you have a kind of a cantankerous PO, and the dev team just keeps saying, nope, this isn't ready. Now, again, as a dev team, I mean, have compassion, be a human. I mean, you know, people aren't perfect, so you don't want to be mean about it. But if you have defined your definition of ready, it shouldn't be a surprise to a PO if they walk in there with a story that's not really well formed, and you're like, we can't groom this. So what do you do if you have nothing groomed? Well, do some tech debt, fix some bugs. That's another great way, going back to the other question of how to get caught up. Take a sprint as a dev team and just do tech debt, just do bugs, do stuff that's not new if you can. I mean, not everybody's in that situation, but if you have that liberty to just take a sprint and just knock down some tech debt and kill some bugs and do all that stuff that's not like the new feature functionality requirements type stuff from the PO, that's great. So you pay down tech debt, you get some bugs out of the way, and you give your PO time to get caught up. So that's also an option if you have that flexibility in your organization.
All right. Now, from the PO's side here, as a PO, you stated not to include technical details on user stories. Should these technical details be on the conditions of satisfaction for the user story?
No. There should be no technical details in here. If there are technical details that need to be had, number one, as a PO, as a proper PO, you are focused on the customer experience. As a customer, I am not experiencing your databases. What I am experiencing is whatever my need is being filled. So there's no room for technical information there. as devs, they're, as you're having conversations in here and you're talking about, well, we may need to implement this, and you may go, oh yeah, don't forget to check that, whatever it is. Write some notes in the comments or attach it to a document or something like that. Put it in Confluence or some space that's shared, but keep it out of the user story and out of the acceptance criteria. What we don't want to see is acceptance criteria that say something like, and this thing, appears on this table in this, whatever. I mean, that's not stuff we're interested in. I don't care what endpoint you have to update. That isn't, as a user, I'm never going to see what's in your JSON. So don't put that stuff in there. It's all about plain English, and it's all about what the user's experience is going to be. And by the way, these acceptance criteria don't apply to things like tech debt and things like that. So that's, you don't have to kill yourselves trying to write gherkins for, just like technical tasks. Like I need to, add a server or something.
Oh, right. What technique do you recommend best for story point estimation?
Using Fibonacci sequence, all the standard stuff. I personally, and this is probably, Agile gods strike me down, but I'm not a big fan of planning poker. I think it's silly. If you do it, great. And if you love it and it works for you, fantastic. I've never used it personally on my Scrum team. So there's any, you can just put your fingers up in the air or whatever, but you wanna, if you're not sure what relative estimation is all about, there's lots of great literature out there. But what we're doing is trying to, I may not know how many grams a strawberry is and how many grams an apple is, but I'm pretty sure that an apple weighs more than a strawberry. So that's kind of what we're trying to get at. And they follow this Fibonacci sequence of 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and basically every number is the sum of the two numbers previous to it. And that's how relative estimation works, and that's what story points are. So again, whatever tool you use to do that, there's plenty out there. That's totally up to your team and what they're comfortable with.
All right. And Tim's been waiting a while for this answer. I've worked with teams who spend the first couple of days of each 3-week sprint refining the tentative sprint backlog. What are the advantages of distributing this activity throughout the sprint?
Boy, there's a lot to unpack there. So the first 3 days are, maybe Tim, let me know real quickly, are you refining the stories for that sprint during that time? That would be.
He says yes.
Okay, so you never want to refine stories for the current sprint that you're in. You want to be sure that you have a backlog that is filled up and ready to go. One of the reasons for this is that you need visibility into what's coming up in the future. You also need time to answer questions. So what if you get into a story where you're in there and you're trying to groom it and you're like, oh my God, we don't know this critical piece of information. Well, all of a sudden, you don't give yourself enough time to answer that question and have it figured out in time to get it queued up and ready for the sprint that you want it to be in. If you're doing that immediately before, in your current sprint, then you're just not gonna have time if some of those questions come up. And then as far as when you do it, there's lots of different ways to schedule things. And then after this, I am gonna have to go because I have a hard stop here in a couple minutes. But there are lots of great ways to schedule these meetings. The key here in all of your meetings and everything that you're scheduling is to block time. You do not want to have a daily stand-up and then wait an hour and then come back for a half-hour grooming and then wait an hour and then come back for a retro and then wait an hour. And then don't do that. It will kill your teams. It kills your concentration. It's so much context switching. So a lot of teams will actually put a half hour on the calendar for their daily stand-up. And they use the first 15 minutes for daily stand-up, the second 15 minutes to groom 3 stories. And then they just do that every day of the week. And so they just stay up, caught up on their backlog doing that. Some teams love to have an hour a week. But it's stacked, right? So it's just, you're not constantly going back and forth between meetings, but it's just attached to either right before lunch or right after lunch when people are already, their concentration's broken. You could do 2 half hours. I mean, it really doesn't matter. It's whatever minimizes the context switching for your team and is enough to keep your backlog groomed ahead of time.
All right, and we will stop there. So sorry if we didn't get to your question today, but feel free to reach out to us, info@livespeed.com, or Lisa, her email address is there. I'd like to invite you to see Lisa in a fun upcoming meetup about designing serious Agile games and designing Agile simulations. That's July 15th. I'm sticking the link in the chat, and it is the DC Lean Agile meetup if you search on meetup.com. So thanks so much for joining us. Lisa, thank you so much for your time and expertise. We loved hearing from you, and everybody have a great day.
Bye, everyone. Stay safe out there.
All right, see ya.